Hello and welcome to The Arise interview. 60 glorious minutes of multifaceted discussion where we speak to the newsmakers as well as ordinary people doing extraordinary things, and we feature the voices at the heart of the stories. I'm John Nnia Nwodo. Coming up in the next hour, they say he oozes political ambition, an ebullient intellectual, a great public speaker, an economist, a lawyer, a two-time minister in both civilian and military regimes in Nigeria, and a former presidential aspirant. And coming from a family where his brother was a governor and his father a member of parliament in the Eastern Nigeria House of Assembly, and later a two-time minister himself, the pedigree of Chief John Nnia Nwodo is quite simply unassailable. But how and why has such a commanding federal figure turned inward, away from the national focus to a more ethnic one as the president of the pan-cultural organization Ohanaeze Ndigbo? The life and times of the pertinacious John Nnia Nwodo in a moment. Now, say what you will about the economist, lawyer and former two-time minister John Nnia Nwodo, one way or another, he has his place in history and will likely enjoy the seal of posterity's approval. At 28, he was already a politician to be reckoned with as a member of the national executive in the NPN, the party that once governed Nigeria, going from that position to become a twice-appointed minister and further still a presidential aspirant. But in spite of all his achievements, many will distill Nnia Nwodo's career into perhaps just one, two or three facts, or maybe just one phrase: president of Ohanaeze Ndigbo, an ethnically centered position some say has led to estrangement in his relations with many from other ethnic groups in Nigeria who once looked up to him, and has severely narrowed his once broad national outlook. But many others disagree and see him instead as someone who has come to reorder the political direction of the Igbos and by extension the rest of the country. Well, in a moment we'll speak to the man himself, Chief John Nnia Nwodo. But first, here he is, recalling his early foray into the Nigerian political sphere.
I recall that under the Second Republic, I joined a party called the MPN, and I became the state secretary of the party in my state, the old Anambra State. And by dint of my position as the state secretary of the party, I was a member of the national executive. I attended the executive meeting of the party, and on the third occasion, I found out that the big names there struggled with the exchange of ideas without reflecting the renaissance feelings of the young. In other words, they were analog and not digital. On the fourth occasion, I tried to raise my hand to speak. Chief Akinloye was chairman. He avoided me. I changed my seat to the middle. I tried to make an eye contact with him. He avoided me. I came to the second seat from the front, and I raised my hand. He still avoided me, and I shouted, "So young men have no contribution in this place?" And Chief Kayode looked at me and said to Chief Akinloye, "Why don't you allow him to speak? Young men should speak." How old were we when we started this business? He said, "Okay, young man, speak quickly. I give you 3 minutes to say what you want to say." The others were not given 3 minutes. I made a sign of the cross in my mind, and I reached my inner recesses to regurgitate my logic and intellectual elocution. And I gave the best speech that I could ever give in my life. At the end of the speech, I not only got an applause, but I got Fani Kayode moving a motion that my conclusion should be adopted as a resolution. And guess who? Shehu Shagari supported the motion. Thereafter, committees were set, and I had the privilege of being asked, "John, you join this committee." Immediately, they began to think that I had something to offer.
Delighted to say that the inimitable Chief John Nnia Nwodo joins me now in the studio. Absolute pleasure to have you here, sir. Thank you very much indeed for coming in. Let's start from the very beginning. You come from a background that you have described as humble, but that many Nigerians would see as elite and even upper class. Your father was a member of the Eastern Nigeria House of Assembly from about 1952 and would later become Minister for Health and later still Minister for Commerce and Industry. What was it like growing up in those circumstances?
First of all, before I answer the question, let me thank you for having me. And
it's a pleasure.
Let me wish my fellow Nigerians who are celebrating a very important part of their Muslim life, Barakat Salah. Now, my background, yes, was privileged. If my grandfather's antecedents and my father's antecedents were the only influence in my life. But at the time we grew up, being born into a royalty, or nobility, or position where you found your father in a position of importance was a greater challenge to prove yourself. You had to live up to the reputation of your parents. Secondly, the social milieu in which we grew up negated those privileges. To begin with, I went to primary school in what you would call rural Enugu. I went to St. Patrick's, Iva Valley.
That's a very interesting point, because that was not an elitist school, was it? But it was good enough.
I was going to explain a few things. First, my parents' decision that I and my brother Ohanaeze and my sister Cecilia go there was because it was run by the Catholic Church to which they belonged, and it was run by a reverend father who was then reputed to be a disciplinarian. He ended up a bishop, the late Bishop Michael Eneja. May his soul rest in peace. And they were close friends. He was close friends of my parents. And but that didn't give me any privilege. If anything, he was harder on me. But what is interesting is that my father had a driver called James Nnia. James had a junior brother called Peter. Peter was my classmate in St. Patrick's, Iva Valley. There was no school for the minister's son and another school for the driver's son or the driver's wife.
So that suggests a very high standard
under
of public schools in those
and
days.
Dr. Okpara.
Right.
There was no stratification of schools in terms. What was important was your performance.
And do you think Nigerian schools have progressed or regressed since that time?
Oh, there has been tremendous retrogression. You know, right now, the children of the privileged go to privileged schools, and the children of the poor go to poor schools. And in the mentality of this class of children, there is a strong class divide and a sense of deprivation and deep sense of dissatisfaction on account of the circumstances of one's birth. Now, you know, if you moved into my secondary school, I was classmates with recipients of my father's scholarship. And they used to beat me in physics, chemistry, biology, 2 of them. Now, I used to beat them in English language, English literature, Bible knowledge, history. The subjects in which I beat them were what you may call subjective subjects. They beat me in the objective subjects. So in mathematics, you either scored it right or wrong.
Absolutely.
So it was easy to get 100%. But in history, you couldn't get 100%. Apart from reciting all the points that were germane to the question, you needed to combat with the mood of the examiner. And
it's also the way you say things, isn't it? It's not just what you say, it's how you say it.
Precisely.
Right.
And so it portrays that here again, we didn't have that class divide. And we were also...
That was CIC in
Yes, College of Immaculate Conception. Right. And we had expatriate teachers and principal, and who did not understand these Nigerian cleavages of background and importance. What was important was your behavior and your
merit.
Standard of merit, you know.
And you were subsequently admitted into the University of Ibadan. And whilst there, you were voted in as the president of the Students' Union, and you were the first non-Yoruba to hold that position. Why do you think you got the job?
Well, first of all, my admission to Ibadan was again another dramatization of merit. At that time, there was no JAMB. We didn't even have a center for the entrance examination in Enugu. I had to travel to Aba. Aba was the only center in what was Eastern region then. I had to stay in a one-room apartment of a gentleman from my town. And they had no reasonable bathroom. We had to have a bath in the open as early as possible so that people living in the compound do not see us naked. Now, at the exam hall, we were given 8 questions to answer 5. I answered 5 questions. And my dad always told me I had to read over my questions, just in case I wanted to write is and I wrote was, so that I could correct my script. After reading through my questions, I had 25 minutes left. And I looked at the questions again, and I saw a question that I thought I knew better. And I started writing the question. And I finished it 2 minutes before the examination time allotted. And I was in difficulty about which one to cancel. And they said, in the next 1 minute, I just wrote, the examiner may choose any 5 that he desires, which was a breach of the examination regulations. But then our results were published in the newspapers, in Daily Times, and they were published in order of merit. And I was number 33 out of 83 students. So if I didn't get myself into that ditch, I probably would have done better. But I didn't know anybody in Ibadan. My parents didn't know anybody in Ibadan. But here was I going to University of Ibadan. And when I got to Ibadan, I made friends in Ibadan. I made more Yoruba friends than I made of Igbo friends. The Yorubas are very cosmopolitan, obeying, and extremely easy to get along with. When it was time for election, before it was time, we had a Kunle Adepoju Memorial Day. Kunle Adepoju was a student who participated in a demonstration against welfare of the catering, the performance of the catering department. There was a Mrs. Akwankwa who was catering officer, and students wanted her removed because we were then doing pay as you eat. And the quality of food, in the view of the students, was seriously compromised, in spite of the fact that it was now costing more to feed. And in the process of the demonstration, the police was invited, and the student was shot dead, right inside the university. So on the eve of his death, students have a night out, a candle night, and there is a procession around the university, and they came to the spot where he died. And at that spot, after the prayers, the president of students, would announce the program for the following day. We usually included a procession to his grave and some kind of prayers in his grave. On this occasion, the president did not have the courage to announce the program and told us that we needed to come the following morning. But the rumor had gone round that government had insisted that we should not march. And so I found myself incapable of resisting the prevarication of a president. And I was a first-year student, so I got up and said, look, one of us fell fighting for our welfare, and we're enjoying the fruits of his sacrifice. And just to walk to his grave and pray for him, our leadership is prevaricating. I like to have a voice vote here as to whether I am alone. And I rhetorically asked students, are we ready to go to the graveyard? And they all said yes.
Well, I'm going to have to ask you to just hold that thought. We'll continue when we come back. We've got to take a break. You're watching the Arise interview. Plenty more still ahead as we continue our chat about the life and times of one of Nigeria's great politicians, Chief John Nnia Nwodo. Stay with us. Welcome back to the Arise interview, where we speak to the newsmakers as well as ordinary people doing extraordinary things around the world and featuring the voices at the heart of the stories. I'm Charles Aniagolo. So the jury is in, and the unequivocal verdict is that John Nnia Nwodo is for many something of a statesman, having reached the commanding heights of intellectual, political and public service in Nigeria. But his legacy in that capacity has been called into question by some who argue that he may have undermined it by his decision to change the focus of his attention from the national to the ethnic in a country that is in dire need of figures that embrace a more federal outlook. On the other hand, his supporters wonder why he should reach out to a country and a government that they say marginalizes many communities, intimidates dissenters, arrests political opponents, and hunts down anybody seen as an enemy. Well, in a moment, we'll hear more from Chief John Nnia Nwodo. But before we do, let's listen to more of him speaking recently about the state of Nigeria.
This country is a federation, in name but not in practice. The essence of a federation is that it's a group of people with diverse characteristics who come together as different people and different units and donate their powers to a federal government. That's what we did in 1963. Now, it means that whoever must lead our country must be someone who is prepared to see himself as an Adesoya who is Yoruba, but also a Nigerian. Speaking for myself, I never knew that I would one day end as an ethnic leader of my people. I went to the University of Ibadan and I stood for election as president of Students' Union in a Yoruba-dominated university. Yoruba students were more than 65% of the population. My opponent was a Yoruba man, Ndigbo. But I beat him resoundingly. I did so because I espoused a politics that was not tribal. I offered solutions to extant problems of the student union that were novel, and it was attractive to the majority of students. I must say that the urban, cosmopolitan, and embracing character of the Yoruba race was also an added factor.
And Chief John Nnia Nwodo is with me in the studio. Thank you for staying with us. I mean, was there a greater spirit of national unity then than there is now?
Oh, yes, undoubtedly. To begin with, when I was a child in Enugu, under Azikiwe's NCNC, a Katsina man called Umaru Altini was voted in as mayor of Enugu, standing on the banner of NCNC. Now, in Lagos, Bono Ojike became deputy speaker in the Lagos House. Dr. Azikiwe almost became premier of Western Nigeria if the Ibadan-Porokpo alliance with the NCNC had not witnessed the crossing of carpets. Now, in Eastern Nigerian government, the Accountant General, Mr. Willoughby, was a Yoruba man. Nobody really had recourse to where you came from on matters of professionalism. No, nothing of the sort. As I went to Ibadan, some of my close, I almost in fact married a Yoruba woman. Some of my closest friends were Yoruba.
And they're no longer your friends today?
They are still my friends today. That is to say, my student friends while I was in Ibadan.
Right.
And they have remained my friends today.
And that platform prepared you, that time at University of Ibadan, where you became the president of the Students' Union, and a very vocal Students' Union, from what I understand, that prepared you for national office and politics. You were voted in unopposed in 1978 into the leadership of the NPN party, and subsequently became a member of the federal cabinet under Shehu Shagari at a very young age. Tell us about that experience.
Well, you already have scripted some of it in the first shot that you gave here. Well, you know, in 1978, when I offered to be secretary of the Anambra branch of the National Party of Nigeria, we had 11 candidates. For the position of chairman, Dr. Nwafor, the former president of Senate, was returned unopposed. 11 of us were asked to speak to the Electoral College. And by some accident, I was the last to speak. After the others had spoken, I knew when the audience liked what they said and didn't like what they said. So I had an advantage of not repeating their mistakes. But it appeared that at the end of my speech, the ovation from the Electoral College was so resounding that my opponents didn't find the need to carry on with the contest. So one by one, they withdrew from the contest. That also showed me that there was some kind of transparency in the process. It showed me that I owed something to the people who gave me this kind of confidence. And working under a man who was president of Nigeria's Senate was a great advantage. Mark you, I must tell you, one other thing I had was that I have had an exposure in my life to prominent leaders of Nigeria. Apart from my tutelage with Dr. Orizu, I was extremely...
And your father, of course.
Yes, I was very close to Dr. Azikiwe. My father was Dr. Azikiwe's minister. But during this period that he was away from Nigeria, his vast estate in Nsukka was being looked after by my father. And when he came back and I was in NPN, or we were trying to form political parties, I was like his errand boy, finding out what was happening everywhere and reporting to him. And significantly, I differed with him when he joined the NPP. And I said...
Was that because it was more of an ethnically
I said to
driven
him that
party?
the Constitution required a national consensus in determining the presidency of the country, and that you could not possibly get it from a tribal party.
Right, and yet, I mean, you at one stage, of course, aspired to be president of Nigeria under the platform of the APP party. You lost and subsequently said that you were cheated out of an agreement, that it was the turn of the Southeast to produce the president. Was that what pushed you? Because you're talking about criticizing Nnamdi Azikiwe for running an ethnically sort of based party. Was that what pushed you to turn inwards, away from the national focus into a more ethnic one, and led you to vie for the presidency of Ohanaeze Ndigbo?
No. I mean, my disagreement with Zeke's decision was not in any way personal.
No, I mean after you've gone through
just 1 second. It was not in any way personal.
Right.
Because we continued to be very close. And I became, in fact, a courier between him and Shehu Shagari in the course of my stay in NPN and in government. And I was one of those who helped to midwife the accord between the MPP and the MPN. You know, when the MPN could not obtain a legislative majority to run a government in spite of winning the presidency. But clearly, the Constitution which was handed over to us required 12 2/3 of the states of Nigeria at that time for a president to emerge. And I didn't see him being able to get that 12 2/3. And I didn't want him, after being president of Nigeria, to go to an election that he would lose. I wasn't able to convince him. But I remained where I was. And in the course of our elections, I never spoke against Zeke, and Zeke never visited my constituency. And at an independent celebration in Abuja here, when I went to greet him in front of the president and so on, he told me in front of them all that he was very proud of me and my conduct in public affairs. However, you've asked a very salient question, and your introduction mentioned all this. I am President General of Ohanaeze Ndigbo. It's a very important position to find oneself with. It's very difficult for an ethnic group like Ndigbo, who are extremely gifted, cosmopolitan, adventurous, distinctive in many fields of life, to ask one man to lead them. I didn't want this position, but I had no choice but to bow to the will of the people. And it became important to do so because the very basis of our national unity has been fractured almost irredeemably. And I find my people on a terrible receiving end. The marginalization against Igbos in the Nigerian polity seems to be an agreement, a post-war agreement of containment.
But critics would say, is it marginalization of the Igbo, or is it that the Igbo have not got their political bearings right in this country? Because out of the three ethnic groups in this country whose political preferences tend to swing electoral votes, the Igbo seem to have constantly missed the boat. In the last election, for example, you backed the wrong horse politically, Atiku instead of Buhari, and in consequence, the position of the ethnic group you represent, the Igbos, has become even more precarious.
I think you make very dangerous assumptions.
Well, I'm asking you
first
a
of all,
question.
but first of all, I have to fault the assumptions in your...
That's what your
Can I say something?
That's what your critics say.
If you don't allow me to reply, then there's not an interview. First of all, your reference to the next election is based on very horrendous assumptions. You assume that the APC won the presidential.
No, I'm saying
please,
what your critics say.
If you don't want me to say what...
Please.
You have said it 3 times.
Yeah, of course.
Allow me to say what my reaction to
it's
what
not
they
my
say
assumption,
is.
it's your critics.
First of all, the jury is still out as to whether that election was won by President Buhari. And in the court of public opinion, you can almost guess what the public thinks. It is no longer a trial of the election, but a trial of the judiciary and its capacity to stand up for the truth. So telling me that I backed a wrong horse would be saying something.
Well, it's a question.
I'm answering the question.
Okay.
Telling me that I backed a wrong horse is a presumption that is not justifiable until we run through the whole race. Secondly, the issue of taking a position that the Igbos have not done good calculation is completely wrong. First, the military designed a constitution at the end of the war.
And make it brief because we're going to take a break.
They designed a constitution to contain the Igbos. We have the smallest number of local governments of all the 6 geopolitical zones, the smallest number of representatives in the National Assembly, the smallest number of local government councils. 2 states in the northwest of Nigeria have as much local governments, and we have in the whole of the southeast.
I'm going to ask you to hold that thought. We'll continue when we come back. You're watching the Arise interview. Plenty more still ahead as we continue our chat with the economist, lawyer, and 2-time former minister, Chief John Nnia Nwodo. Stay with us. Welcome back to the Arise interview, where we speak to the newsmakers as well as ordinary people doing extraordinary things around the world and featuring the voices at the heart of the stories. I'm John Nnia Nwodo. Now, my guest today is the president of Ohanaeze Ndigbo, Chief John Nnia Nwodo, economist, lawyer, former 2-time minister, and some would say blazing intellectual. He's also an avowed champion of restructuring, who believes that every day is the eve of this country's destruction unless it overhauls its politics and governance structures, which have become mired in a sort of institutional disrepute with little credibility and with more and more people feeling increasingly less represented. In virtually every public speech he's made in the last few years, Chief Nwodo has called for Nigeria to be restructured, with less power at the center and more autonomy for the regions. Take a listen to a snippet from one such speech.
We must look for leadership, not just in Nigeria, but in our various states. In people who have a unifying character, who have a capacity to see that you cannot have a federation where the heads of all the security apparatus come from one side of the country. It strikes at the fundamental basis of our unity and our sensibility. It makes our leader look tribal. And it makes us look at Nigeria like as if she was your wife being raped by 10 people and you're ready to walk away as if nothing was happening. Our patriotism is destroyed when you have a tribal leadership. Nigeria, any leader does not recognize that the cost of our underdevelopment, the cost of our bickering, the cost of our mixed standards is the fact that we do not have a structured nation. Don't vote for him.
and he is, of course, one of the leading proponents of restructuring Nigeria, Chief John Nnia Nwodo, and he is with me in the studio. And I'd really like to talk about restructuring, but I would also like you to finish what you were saying previously. And you were talking about the provenance, the origins of that continued sort of wandering in the political wilderness of the Igbos in this country.
Yes, I first told you that the constitution that was handed over to us by the military, which in legal terms is not a touch on us. What that means is that it has no validity in law because there is no referendum, there's no plebiscite. It was promulgated by a decree, which was like an act of parliament, by a parliament composed of military officers who were not chosen on a representative basis, who were therefore not exercising the mandate of the people whom they made a constitution for. So in any legal jurisdiction in the world with civilization, this constitution is a misnomer. However, it is de jure and de facto the law under which we are governed. But it is predicated on extreme discrimination and sectionalism and the capacity to jaundice a particular people, namely the Igbos. Well, even our constitution, even our demography, the National Population Commission has no index for religion or ethnicity. When we were given a quit notice in northern Nigeria, I tried to do a census of Igbos in northern Nigeria, and I found we were 11.6 million Igbos in northern Nigeria. In the last election, I found that 3.5 million Igbos were registered in Lagos. Therefore, our population is a lot more than what is used to divide these administrative units.
Well, certainly there is a question mark, and it's not just the Igbos. A lot of other groups also question the figures that are bandied around in terms of the population distribution in this country. But why?
I agree with that. But you have asked me to speak the views of my people, which I'm doing.
No, I totally understand that. But why is it, let me ask you this as president of Ohanaeze Ndigbo, why is it so important for the Igbo or an Igbo to be president of Nigeria? I mean, in many other areas of this country's national life, politics is just one. They are equal to or have overtaken unquestionably other ethnic groups in this country, in business, in the economy, in academia, in international achievements, in domestic accomplishments. Why is the presidency so important?
Well, the reason you ask this question is that you probably assume that the cardinal policy of Ohanaeze is to promote an Igbo presidency. You're quite wrong. Our policy is to have a country where every Nigerian has equal right to access the position of the president, and where he's assessed on his merit rather than on his ethnic background. Since the end of the war, there's been a conscious attempt to shield Igbos from important positions in our country. And so if this is a discrimination against Igbos, we are saying that this is wrong.
But you're saying if, is it?
It is, because the evidence abounds that you just played my script where I dramatized it. In every sector of Nigeria's economy or administration, the commanding heights are denied Igbos. But in the areas where personal enterprise is required, the Igbos achieve all that you have described out of their own dint of hard work and ingenuity.
And how much has this principle of federal character, how much has that hurt the Igbo? Because I understand it was designed, I was actually listening to you saying that, it was designed to de-emphasize merit in civil and public service and even in education.
Do you know that the Emir of Kano once went public saying...
That's Lamida Sanusi.
Yes, he went public saying that the conspiracy of the North and the Yorubas at the end of the war to marginalize Igbos from areas of political and economic control should really be revisited, because the bulk of the Igbo that this hate policy is visited on were not there during the war. And so it is unfair to do this.
And is that where the Ohanaeze Ndigbo that you head comes in? Is that an attempt to reorder the political direction of the Igbo to be a sort of centralized authority in the absence of a proper political structure in Igbo land?
Every ethnic group in Nigeria has a socio-cultural organization. And goes back to the history of this country. This federation was contrived by the various people, ethnic groups that compose the country. And they it was several conferences in Nigeria as well as in London that led to a union and a fundamental principle under which this union should exist. And we were doing well when we were allowed to run our respective areas. And it didn't matter who was Prime Minister of Nigeria, because it didn't directly affect the productivity in the various areas. Eastern Nigeria was the fastest growing economy in Black Africa. It was the first place that you had a black iron and steel complex in the whole of Black Africa. It was the first regional government to build a cement factory. It was the first regional government to build a brewery. Its educational policy was second to none in Black Africa, except in Western Nigeria. And commanding heights were attained by our people in all parts of the world. And our people see this as a dream they want to get back to. Now, today, just to get into a university, you have to resort to quota system. And it is done according to our administrative units, irrespective of your score in an examination. We can't live on that system.
Yeah, but some would say that if that was the case, then why aren't the Igbos developing their own part of the country at the pace that they seem to want to see the rest of Nigeria sort of open up to?
There is no state government in the southeast.
I mean, why aren't they cooperating more with
There is
each
no
other?
state government in the southeast which has the potential for the kind of development that you are talking about. Now, I have launched an Ndigbo fund. But even that Ndigbo fund, its capacity to catalyze our development is subject to federal government control. For us to catalyze our highways into autobahns, which are the things we want to do our railways, we need federal government permission. Some roads are federal roads.
So do you believe that, as some suggest, the Igbo are being punished for failing to, I mean, I'm talking about contemporary times,
Yes.
being punished for failing to support Buhari in 2015 and 2019?
I think the Igbos are being contained because they believe that the Igbo potential is real. And the Igbo potential will challenge some of the assumptions and usages of our time and enthrone merit and productivity. Look, my friend, as I speak to you, our country is spending 70% of its annual revenue on servicing its debts without retiring the principal. As I speak to you, America is producing 12 million barrels of shale oil, 5 million of which will be devoted to domestic market, and 7 million injection into the international market. And we produce only 1.7 million. That means that obeying the law of demand and supply, the oil price is going to crash.
Right.
The IMF has warned us, the World Bank has warned us.
So there needs to be a change of direction.
Precisely.
Okay,
Unless we emphasize on the policies rather than on the persons. That's why I say it's not important who is president of Nigeria, so long as the standards apply equally to
Okay, well,
everyone.
let me bring, because we've got about 2 minutes before we take another break. I was going to ask you, is that, and you've put it very clearly, very lucidly, is that why your position appears to be to anchor everything on a reassessment of the constitutional and political structure of Nigeria and restructure in such a way as to restore a political economy that's based on merit and competition?
Indeed, you've said it better than I could say it. And look, let me tell you, you see, once you restore a vibrant economy here, economy will take a primary place to politics. Right now, we don't even consider the merits of the people we vote into office. Our electoral machinery has been so corrupt. It has never been as corrupt as it is today. That even young men who have something to offer do not have the zeal to come to the stage because they don't believe there will be an election. The whole thing is a balancing act and the recycling of mediocrity of the worst kind. That's not what I grew up in.
That's a good point, and I think a lot of people would agree with you. But of course, given the way Nigerian politics, as you correctly mentioned, is fractured, in order to achieve this, you would have to build, as president of Ohanaeze and Ndigbo, political alliances to achieve your aims. Have you been able to build alliances across the ethnic divide with groups that accept restructuring as their key agenda, or is this something that is very focused within sort of Igbo society?
Look, restructuring is the most popular policy in present Nigeria. To begin with, the ruling party itself offered it in its manifesto.
Okay, I'm going to ask.
I'm coming.
No, we
You
have
asked
to take
me a
break.
question.
I'm very sorry about this. We have to take a break, but we will continue this when we come back. My apologies for that.
Thank you.
You're watching the Arise interview. Plenty more still ahead. Stay with us. Welcome back to the Arise interview, where we speak to the newsmakers as well as ordinary people doing extraordinary things around the world and featuring the voices at the heart of the stories. I'm Charles Nnia Nwodo. Now, if you ask anyone outside Nigeria why the country has performed poorly in the past 59 years or so, they are likely to attribute it to corruption, ethnic rivalries, religious divisions, and poor leadership. But inside Nigeria, a movement has emerged that challenges those accepted reasons for underdevelopment. The movement is made up of Nigerians from all walks of life, including politicians and prominently the opposition PDP presidential candidate and former Vice President of Nigeria, Atiku Abubakar. And of course, my guest today, Chief John Nnia Nwodo, President of the pan-cultural organization Ohanaeze Ndigbo. Not everyone, though, is keen on restructuring, with some believing that certain regions might be disadvantaged in a decentralized arrangement. In fact, in June 2018, President Buhari accused those calling for the country to be restructured of pursuing their own personal interests. Well, for more on all that, Chief John Nnia Nwodo, champion of restructuring, is still with me in the studio, talking about that as well as his life and times. Thank you very much indeed for staying with us. And before we went on break, you were talking about building alliances across Nigeria.
Yes, I was first of all saying, the president has not been faithful to his manifesto. He went to election promising restructuring. After he won election, his party set up a committee headed by the governor of Kaduna.
So you concede he won the election?
Before he was declared winner.
Right.
And which result is still being contested, as I said before. His party had this committee on restructuring, and they made a recommendation which was accepted by his national executive party. And when he first interviewed from the press, he said our problem was not structure but process. He swallowed his manifesto. He swallowed the decision of his national executive committee. And he says we are looking for our personal interest. It's rather the president who is looking for his personal interest. It seems to me that in Nigeria, to speak to government seems to be a crime. But that is the necessary and inevitable ingredient of politics. I have to speak to the people who represent us,
of course,
as to what our views are. The president has failed it by not resonating the majority aspirations of Nigeria and the declared intentions of his own manifesto and his party. Secondly, you talked about alliance. The alliance for restructuring first exists in the ruling party and in its entire national executive. It exists in the ethnic geopolitical groups that cut across southern and northern Nigeria. The entire of southern Nigeria is for restructuring, as represented by Afenifere, by Ohanaeze, by Pandef, and the Middle Belt, which spans across a number of states in northern Nigeria, and elements of the far north. Because, as I said at the beginning of this program, the economic trajectory of the world has changed to two important factors: technology, levering on new means of production and what have you, computer technology, as well as agriculture. Now, with oil receding as a source of national revenue, in a restructured Nigeria, northern Nigeria will be richer than the rest of Nigeria. Look at Netherlands. Netherlands is the 14th largest economy in the world. And Netherlands exports $100 billion of dairy and agricultural products, apart from other exports. And no time in our national life have we had $100 billion from oil imports, exports. Therefore, if we husbanded the natural resources of agriculture in northern Nigeria, restructuring will favor northern Nigeria more than any part of Nigeria. And so those who think that the idea of restructuring is to deprive northern Nigeria of oil revenue, which is a wasting and receding asset, are myopic and unpatriotic.
Right. Okay. Well, let me move the conversation on from that, because you're such a fascinating person to talk to. I want to get your take on some other issues taking place in Nigeria at the moment, as yourself, someone who's been a national politician and who still has a largely national outlook. Let's talk about the arrest and continued detention of Omoyele Sowore, the campaigner and former presidential candidate who called for revolution now protest, because in a different sort of way you're calling for the same thing. He's a lawyer. I mean, as a lawyer yourself, is there anything at all in Mr. Sowore's utterances or actions or body language that in your professional assessment justifies his arrest and incarceration?
Why do you make his case look so exemplary? In the Southeast, we have a group of young men who say, we don't want to be part of this country again. We want Biafra. It does not meet our aspirations to continue to be Nigerians. And they are not violent. They are not carrying any guns. And they have a freedom of speech under our constitution. Under international conventions that we subscribe to, people are free to associate and to hold opinions independent of that of government. When I was a student, we picketed in the House of Parliament, we picketed in Buckingham Palace, and nobody arrested us. If anything, the police protected us in England. Why should there be proscribed for saying this?
So is there something about the idea of protests and citizens' movements that brings out this negative response?
What I'm trying to say is that Sowore is entitled to say that he doesn't like what's going on here. It is his fundamental right. We have reduced our security service into a Gestapo. If you speak against the government, then you're committing a crime. That is balderdash. There is nothing in our laws. And as I said, the judiciary is on trial. The judiciary is on trial. And I won't be surprised if judges are intimidated by revelations of their personal grievances in order for them to toe the line of what they are wanted to say in court. This is not a democracy. It's not the way it's practiced anywhere in the world. And unfortunately, the young generation are learning to be mute, to be silent, to be unassertive of their rights. As a student in Ibadan, I led a demonstration against General Gowon because he said 1976 was unrealistic and would not return our country to democracy.
Yes, I remember reading about that.
And I led a demonstration of students. Our universities were closed. We got on the entire Nigerian students across the line. There was no tribal coloration of it. And it became clear that we were not just speaking for ourselves, we were speaking for the military. Because in order to contain the public outpour, the military had to discipline itself by calling Gowon to order. That right now, our parliament does not resonate the views of the people they represent. Our government does not resonate the views of its own party or the views of the people at large.
Right. So
and the civil populace is lethargic. And every day they go to British High Commission and American Embassy expecting them to fight our wars. Who fights theirs? The President of America is under investigation in the Congress as I speak to you. He takes bullets every day from politicians. And it gives him an opportunity to stand up for his own conviction and give his own side of the story.
Well, let me ask you this, because we've got about 2 minutes left before the end of the program. There's another current national issue, now that we've got you here. I wonder what you think of the new cabinet announced by President Buhari. Do they meet the standards that you were expecting and hoping for, or were they based simply on people who supported the president during the election?
First, I abhor the fact that the president was elected, so to speak, in February, and in August we don't have a functioning cabinet. It is lethargic, it is slow. It does not give the impression of a man who has folded his sleeves. Secondly, the recycling of people whose cases are hanging in our courts for corrupt enrichment into the highest executive body of the country denies it of trust, of tabula. You know, to be minister, you have to have your hands clean.
And of course, you've been minister twice.
I came out of Shagari's government with 13,000 naira in my account. And I said so publicly. You know, if you are not prepared to renounce self and give service, you shouldn't go to be a minister. My father left as minister without any assets. At the end of the war, I had to be a conductor to make sure that there was domestic
Yes, I remember reading
economy
about
in my family. And I'm very happy to be for it. You have to choose whether you want public service or money. Shagari told me that public service and money do not mix. You can't be a Dangote and a president at the same time. You know, so, you know, I do not know. The cabinet doesn't give me any hope for a future. I see nobody there who champions an economic policy that is bound to rejuvenate Nigeria.
Right. And on that instructive note, Chief John Nnia Nwodo, it's been an absolute pleasure having you on the program. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you for having me.
Well, that's it for this edition of The Arise Interview. Join us again for a fresh edition tomorrow. From me and the entire team here in Abuja, bye-bye, and thank you for watching.